Hello, everybody, and welcome to COP28 Hot Off the Press. Thank you for joining today's webinar, where we'll be discussing COP28. COP28 came to a close yesterday with an agreement that has been hailed as historic, and to quote the UN climate change, the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era by laying the ground for a swift, just, and equitable transition, underpinned by deep emissions, cuts, and scaled up finance. At the heart of the COP28 negotiations was the culmination of the first ever global stocktake under the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions. The stocktake is a 5-yearly process designed to check progress against the Paris Agreement goals and to inform the next round of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs as they're known. In the final agreement, which arrived after what's been described as shuttle diplomacy going on to the early hours of yesterday morning, COP28 called on all countries to contribute to a list of goals. And these goals that have to be contributed towards include the need for deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in line with the 1.5 C threshold. Transitioning away from fossil fuels and accelerating action in this critical decade. Countries to contribute to the goal of tripling renewable energy capacity and doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030, and recognizing different national circumstances. So what does it all mean? After nearly 30 years, this is the first time a COP agreement has explicitly called out on fossil fuels. And while this might be the biggest step forward since the Paris Agreement, by itself, it's unlikely to be enough to keep global temperatures under the 1.5 C threshold, simply because emissions have continued at historic rates. Nonetheless, in the longer term, the agreement, and in particular the commitment to contribute to the transitioning away from fossil fuels, is largely seen as positive. So how much progress has really been made? Does the agreement bring us closer to getting to net zero by 2050? Are the financing commitments adequate? How will these commitments be monitored and enforced? To look at all these points, I'm joined today by an esteemed panel. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the panelists. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Nasser Saidi. Dr. Nasser is the founder and chairman of the Clean Energy Business Council, or the CEBC, and he's also president of Nasser Saidi and Associates, an economic and financial consultancy advisory. Dr. Nasser was also the former chief economist and strategist of the Dubai International Financial Center, and he also previously served as the Minister of Economy and Trade and the Minister of Industry of Lebanon and first Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon. Then moving on to Maria Scanlan. Maria is a legal director at Crescent Petroleum, the first and largest private upstream oil and gas company in the region. Maria was previously a head of legal at the Royal Bank of Scotland, and prior to that, worked in private practice in the UK and New Zealand. She also has experience in international trade and foreign policy as part of New Zealand's diplomatic corps. Maria is currently a board member of the Association of Corporate Council's MENA chapter, where she also co-leads the ESG committee. Next, Kishan Khoday. Kishan is the regional team leader, environment and energy with the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, where he leads up UNDP's cooperation across the Middle East and North Africa region on the energy transition, climate adaptation, water security, ecosystems, and biodiversity. Kishan has been with the UN for over 25 years, leading cooperation on the Sustainable Development Agenda through assignments in China, India, Indonesia, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And last, but certainly by no means least, my colleague, Sarah Ellington. Sarah is a partner at Watson Farley & Williams and an ESG specialist. Sarah is particularly known for her work on ESG, including human rights, technology, outsourcing, and fraud disputes, as well as an ESG and impact advisory. Sarah has experience in complex and high-profile group litigation, as well as advising on complaints to non-judicial mechanisms such as the OECD national contact points, UN special procedure mandates, and private sector-based accountability mechanisms. Thank you all for joining us today. Kishan, can we start with the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degrees threshold? The global stocktake recognises the science that indicates global greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut dramatically by 2030 compared to 2019 levels, and to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. By then, they're looking at around a 43% cut by 2030. But the stocktake also notes that parties are off track when it comes to meeting their Paris Agreement goals. The wording in the COP28 agreement does not include any near-term targets, but it really focuses very much on net zero emissions by 2050. So where did we get to, and what does it mean for the countries that you're working with?
Thanks so much. Thanks for having UNDP in this important roundtable on the COP28 outcomes. A pleasure to be here. No, indeed, the stocktake was an important moment, really, to see where we're at since the passage of the Paris Agreement some years ago, and of course the enactment of the National Climate Plans, the NDCs, thereafter, and where we are in terms of action to actually bend the curve towards the 1.5. As noted through the discussions over those 2 weeks, we're still way off course, way off track. We're still on target for 2.7 to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Given rising emissions, as you said, we're at historic levels of emissions, this year, of course, being the hottest on record. And we obviously have seen this in the region through quite severe impacts from protracted droughts that have gone on for many years now, record levels of forest fires, a water emergency, and various other impacts that we've seen, not just this year, but obviously over the years. And this is escalating, accelerating, and when we see the impacts, we're seeing the impacts on communities across the region and globally, the poorest and most vulnerable. The region has already seen quite a spike in poverty rates over the last decade across the region, particularly in the fragile crisis context of the region. And this is one of the factors alongside conflict and other drivers of that. So climate is no longer an environment issue, it's really an issue of crisis and emergency, as the Secretary General has said. As you said in the stocktake report and the decision out of the COP28, indeed, we have to rapidly, as it's mentioned in the decision, rapid and deep cuts to emissions, 43% by 2030, but indeed 60% by 2035. And of course, net zero by 2050. And so achieving 60% emission reduction cuts by 2035 is a major challenge, given that we're seeing globally, on average, an increase of emissions, an expansion of production and consumption of oil and gas and other fossil fuels, of course. And so this needs to radically change. That obviously was the main focus, on bending this curve and on moving, therefore, to a transition away from fossil fuels. And so the road to 2030 obviously has this now front and center. I think the discursive power, let's say, of a conference like the COP came out clearly in terms of the demands by the vast majority of countries to move towards, something closer to a phase down. I think 130 countries were backing that, right? So I think that's clear when we look at the vast majority of the population on the planet, and particularly those that are most vulnerable. And so I think rapidly implementing that transition away from fossil fuels will, in fact, be, yes, the focus going forward towards COP29, COP30. And I think, therefore, the key focus in my mind would be, how do we then, as we go to the next set of NDCs, the National Climate Plans, by COP30 in the next, let's say, 18 months, as countries develop their enhanced NDCs, putting that transition away from fossil fuels front and center, in addition to, of course, expanding renewables and energy efficiency, of course, but as a way of offsetting rather than just adding to the power mix. So I think that point of transition away from fossil fuels is indeed the key focus, I think, going forward to actually bend this curve towards 1.5. As UN Development Program, of course, we work with our partners around the world, our country partners, in terms of trying to achieve some of these goals. Tripling renewable energy is by no means an easy feat. So bringing in new policies, new finance, and new business models to make that kind of rapid expansion happen. but also indeed energy efficiency and generally new national strategies for actually achieving this energy transition.
Thank you, Kishan. It's certainly there's certainly a lot to do, a lot of challenges, and I think very ambitious but necessary. As you said, it's not just a question of the environment. It is a crisis, and to achieve that 43% and indeed the 60% you mentioned by 2035 is a huge undertaking in a very short time. Maria, if I could stay on this subject and just go over to you and talk a little bit about, the agreement mentions accelerating zero and low emission technologies, including carbon capture and utilization and storage. And it also recognizes that transitional fuels can play a role in facilitating the energy transition. Can companies at the forefront, how can the companies at the forefront of the energy transition rise to these challenges that are needed to achieve to net zero?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly speak for the company that I work in, and we do see ourselves as playing a crucial part in terms of the transition, and we produce 80% of our production is actually gas, which is obviously a cleaner source of energy. As a company, we've reduced our carbon intensity to 6 kgs per CO2e. Which is the lowest in the MENA region and 1/3 of the global industry average. So it is something that we as a company take very, very seriously, and we have been working really hard to offset the remaining emissions to maintain the company's carbon neutrality for the 3rd year running since 2021. So on behalf of my company, obviously, I can say that it's something that we take very seriously, but we also see ourselves as playing a role in the energy transition as a whole, in particular because a lot of our concessions are actually in the pioneering jurisdictions of Iraq, for example, where the populations are heavily reliant on us in order to supply their electricity needs. So, I think hydrocarbons in particular, the cleaner hydrocarbons like gas, do play a very important role in that transition journey. Obviously I can only speak for my company as a regional player. But I think, just echoing what Kishan was saying, it's not an easy feat. I mean, these are very lofty commitments that have been put forward. However, they're necessary. And I think, speaking on behalf of a regional company, we take them very seriously, and we see ourselves as playing an important role in that journey.
Oh, thank you for that. And lofty but necessary commitments. Indeed, there's a big balancing act, I think, to be achieved. It is a journey, but it's a journey I think that we all need to get to. And I suppose the message in a way is that there's a number of paths to get there. And the important point is that we're actually moving and driving things forward. Dr. Nasser, if I could move on to you. We saw a lot of material commitments or announcements during COP28 from both governments and also from the private sector when it comes to financing. We saw commitments to the Green Climate Fund. We saw commitments to the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund, as well as the Adaptation Fund. So a lot of announcements. And we also saw private sector banks coming together saying that they were also going to commit to green financing. But it seems that these commitments still fall short of what is needed to implement NDCs and really to achieve all of these really ambitious targets that we've been talking about. What progress has been made and what challenges remain in funding the energy transition?
Thank you. Thank you for having me with you. You're right to point to the challenges, and I think we've discussed those just earlier now. I think the starting point needs to be that we are in crisis. The crisis will accelerate. We have to rely on science. And if I look at the IPCC report, we're moving towards tipping points in terms of our overall climate. Now, the critical thing about tipping points is that we don't understand the dynamics of climate once we reach those tipping points, where you've got melting of glaciers, all sorts of issues that arise as a result of it. And particularly in our part of the world, we are the most exposed, I think, of all regions in the world to climate stress and the impact of that. So I just wanted to mention this because when we talk about the positive achievements, and you mentioned some of them, the loss and damage fund, the commitments to create various funds, all of those I think are very positive. So I think when one looks back at COP28, we have to admit that having a stock take, greater realization, an important contribution, I think, this time around, although it was criticized, is the inclusion of the private sector and business. Critical in my view, because we're not going to be able to achieve any of the goals that we're talking about if you don't include the private sector. I think that's an important item. And the reason is that the private sector owns the technology, owns the new sources of energy. We're talking about hydrogen, when you're talking about carbon capture, a whole slew of things in terms of improvements of energy efficiency. All of those are really being developed in the private sector. The question is, what sort of incentives do you give? Now, what was said at COP28 is that we're going to provide funding. But the type of funding we're talking about, even though that it sounds like large numbers in terms of 100 billion here or 60 billion there, is really a drop in the ocean. What we know from any other source is that we're going to need something like 3.5 trillion per year in terms of renewable energy from now to 2030. Now, that's a minimal number in my view. As temperatures increase and as the climate crisis increases, that amount is going to get revised upwards. Now, there are some critical decisions that need to be taken, because what we're talking about is transforming the way we live, the way we work, the way we interact. And to put all these numbers in context, the IMF tells us that back in 2022, we were subsidizing fossil fuels at the tune of about $7.5 trillion per year. So we're subsidizing. So, and at the same time, so we're being a bit schizophrenic. We continue subsidizing fossil fuels with all the implications of that in terms of net zero emissions, temperatures, and the like. And we're saying at the same time, let's fund renewable energy. Now, part of the solution is to say, I want to gradually remove the fossil fuel subsidies and use the savings from the reduction in fossil fuel subsidies to maybe provide incentives to renewable energy. Now, the most positive aspect, and sorry to come back to our region, the same numbers from the IMF tell us that our region, the MENA region, provided subsidies to the tune of $760 billion to fossil fuels. Okay, those are large numbers that we're talking about. So starting point, I think, which was not really discussed, as far as I know, in COP28, is how do you phase out those subsidies? Because when you talk about phasing out the subsidies, it means a lot of companies that are reliant on cheap sources of energy and energy-intensive companies will have to retransform their business and go towards less intensive uses of energy. It also means that we're going to have financing not from government. The bulk of the financing has to come from the private sector, whether it's by investment in companies or funding from banks and the public markets. That I think that is where we will need to look for much of the funding moving forward. And what we're talking about is a minimum just for renewable and clean energy is at least 3.5 trillion per year. So that I think needs to be our main focus as we move forward. And as we do that, I think we need to think, in my view, of new institutions. The banks certainly are saying we're willing to provide financing for green projects, etc. But the truth of the matter is very little has actually come through. So let's be very clear. We need two types of financing. One is for climate risk mitigation, which is renewable energy, electric vehicles, everything that falls in terms of minimizing the risk of climate change. But probably much more important, in my view, is climate adaptation. The fact of the matter is that we're highly unlikely to stay below 2.5 degrees, maybe even 3 degrees. Those are daunting numbers. So what we'll need is to make sure that our infrastructure, which includes our housing, public utilities, core infrastructure, is climate resistant. It is not at the moment. And we've seen disasters, climate disasters, and they will accelerate. So I think the bulk of the funding, beyond the challenge of tripling renewable energy, the bulk of the funding is going to have to start going to climate risk adaptation, and therefore infrastructure will play a major role. And we'll need to find new institutions. My view is that we need an independent climate bank at a global level. A climate bank that is just focused on financing climate risk mitigation as well as adaptation. Having another fund of 100 billion under the governance of, say, the World Bank or other institutions, I don't think answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser. And I mean, there are a lot of staggering numbers in there, what's needed, but also obviously what's still paid out in subsidies. And obviously if the subsidies were to be phased out eventually, obviously these could clearly be used to facilitate the growth of the renewables sector, clean energy sector, and also to help fund in terms of climate adaptation. And it's an interesting idea, and I think one that definitely, I think, warrants much further discussion in terms of having an independent climate bank. Kishan, if we could stay on that topic and particularly around climate adaptation, climate risk mitigation, and the topic of funding, can you talk about what progress was made on the loss and damage fund? And you know, was it real progress? What does it actually mean? And we've heard the numbers, and it does sound like there's a big disconnect. Although there's a commitment to the fund, it sounds like there's a vast amount more that's needed. And I think the other thing there is that whilst we have this fund, there's no firm obligation on developed countries to actually pay into it. So what impact will that have? And what are your views in terms of where we got to on the loss and damage fund?
Absolutely excellent question. I think that, I mean, it was an important moment at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last year to actually make that significant progress to have that decision among the parties to move forward with establishing this new fund. And then obviously at the start of you know, all the work over the past year between COP27 and COP28 to get there through the steering committee process, et cetera, and then to have this agreement among the parties during COP28 on some of the details of establishing the fund and going ahead with it, the Secretariat, the board, which is going to meet for the first time next month, and some of the initial contributions to the tune of $700 billion of pledges, commitments from a few parties. I think some estimates put it at about $400 billion a year at the moment. I think the loss and damage estimates. So possibly, you know, the contributions at the moment, about 2% of what's needed, I think, is some of the estimates that I've seen, or maybe less than that. That's, of course, expected to increase quite dramatically as the climate crisis, of course, accelerates and escalates, and we keep going with these record emissions until there's a turning, a bending of that curve. And so we're definitely seeing that. I saw one study out there that said, you know, the last, I think it's 50 years or something of emissions globally, has put in so much heat into the atmosphere, the heat that's out there at the moment, the carbon that's out there in the atmosphere already, the amount that's heat that's trapped in the atmosphere from all the emissions over the past 50 years is the equivalent of about 20 billion nuclear bombs. something like this in terms of the amount of heat generated, not the other impacts, obviously, of bombs. But in terms of the heat that's generated into the system, it's quite a massive amount of heat. And so therefore, it's obvious why we're seeing the hottest year ever, and, let alone 2030 and beyond. So I think loss and damage is definitely something that's scaling up the attention to it. Unfortunately, we're not really bending the government mission. So that's one of the impacts of that. We're likely to see between 200 million, even up to $1 billion people in terms of climate refugees, climate displaced people globally in coming decades. That's one example of an impact of this. We're likely to see entire species, if not ecosystems, extremely fragile, if not extinct, owing to climate change. I'm not sure that there's really a monetary value yet on many of these kind of impacts on lives, on existence of entire species. So I think that the idea of addressing loss and damage, yes, as you said, is it compensation or is it aid? So is it aid to respond to a disaster? Nothing new. There's been aid for responding to disasters for a long time. I think the idea here is really some kind of compensation to communities by those who have generated this crisis. I think that's what a lot of communities out there in the world see as a need. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, and as you said rightly yourself, in terms of really seeing what's going to be the role for this kind of finance. I think there's a lot of work to be done about identifying the kind of losses and damages that would be eligible, the mechanisms for compensating. Is it to communities? Is it to countries, etc. I think there's a lot of assessments that need to be done in terms of economic loss and damage, social loss and damage, ecological loss and damage. I think that's a big challenge. So I think there's a lot of hope for this new process. I have to say, obviously, that just to also second what Dr. Saidi mentioned, that every $1 that's put into adaptation saves you $6 in loss and damage. Every penny that you put towards the transition away from fossil fuels saves you, I don't know how much on loss and damage, like a huge amount of loss and damage, obviously. And so I think that COP28 didn't do, I think it was below expectations in terms of really advancing that goal of a global goal on adaptation. That didn't really get achieved in a big way at COP28 as expected. That's obviously going to go ahead to the next COPs, which is an important thing, as Dr. Saidi mentioned as well. I think that's a priority that we really need to focus on, is having that global goal on adaptation with specific targets, expanded finance. I think climate finance is an important part of it in general for adaptation and mitigation. And today, I think some estimates are 60-70% of all climate finance is debt related. We're, of course, in a debt crisis in many countries around the world and across the MENA region. And so I think there is a need to not just use debt instruments for this. I think there's big scope for other forms of finance that go to really achieve this goal of scaling up finance. As UN Development Program, one of the key things we're going to be doing in the next couple of years is helping countries establish their national adaptation plans, including in the MENA region. A number of countries in the MENA region are going to be working with to establish national adaptation plans. Those end up being kind of sovereign investment plans for scaling up action and investments on adaptation. Climate resilient food systems, climate resilient water systems, climate resilient infrastructure, protecting lives and livelihoods, early warning systems, so that the actual impacts of climate-induced disasters are reduced through early warning systems. If we look at the crisis that happened in Libya or in many countries across the region, Somalia, et cetera, early warning systems is just a key part of it and one of the flagship initiatives of the Secretary General and the UN system as a whole in coming years. So I think there's a lot to be done still going to the next COPs, but there's also a lot that we're working with our partners to actually try to advance at the policy level, but also in practical capacity development of communities to make sure that they can be resilient to these expanding impacts.
Thank you, Kishan. And certainly resilience and adaptation, it's a massive, massive challenge. And it goes back to what you said in your first intervention, that, it's not just the environment we're talking about. There is a crisis that does need action. And so I think the progress, yes, we've seen, but as you've clearly indicated, there's a lot more to be done. And as Dr. Saidi mentioned, as Dr. Nasser mentioned, we also need to make sure that there's real collaboration with the private sector. It's not just governments that need to take responsibility. It's the private sector that own technology, that are developing new technology and that are also financing a lot of the initiatives. So Maria, I'd like to move back to you, if that's all right, and just talk a little bit about the just transition. What does it mean for there to be a just transition? And from your perspective, how was this addressed during COP28?
Yes, I think given the commitments in COP28 to transition away from fossil fuels, I think the focus on just transition moves us to the implementation of these goals, but achieving the right balance, I think, between the economic and environmental aspects of climate action against the social impacts of the transition. And I think it's important that they're given, pretty equal consideration in that assessment in terms of how these are implemented vis-a-vis specific countries. Now, we all know that just transition doesn't just help with climate action, but it helps advance progress against all of the sustainable development goals. And in particular, those related to affordable and clean energy, to decent work and economic growth, reduced inequalities, and responsible production and consumption. So these are all really important factors in terms of how we achieve just transition. And the key issue is that, just transition can mean very different things to different countries. So I think what we need to achieve, like with any, multilateral forum, is to try and get the countries together and foster that ongoing dialogue. That I think was very much a focus for COP28 in terms of the inclusivity of, different countries. Admittedly, there were, there were also some negative comments on the part of some countries that felt that they were not sufficiently included, and I think those need to be addressed so that everyone feels that they have participated equally. But certainly, the aim of this COP was to ensure that it was a much more inclusive COP, that different voices were heard, and Indigenous voices were heard. And to try and develop to the extent possible a common vision for what that means, what just transition means. And I think that has to be the aim for the next COP. I know that that's not easily achieved, having myself worked in WTO related issues, and having to get agreement with what at the time was 181 participant countries is no easy feat, because everyone comes from a very different angle. But I think being cognizant of the different needs of developing countries vis-a-vis developed countries, and actually the responsibility on the developed countries to really be at the forefront of reducing carbon emissions is really important. But in terms of how COP28, I'm going to focus on the positive things of COP28, because there are many things that could have been done better, as Kishan and Dr. Nasser have highlighted. But in terms of the positive, I think there was a declaration on gender responsive just transitions, and that was really key. I think it's important to incorporate the human rights of women and girls in any just transition discussions, including through social dialogue and working with the key decision makers. That's really important. Obviously, we've talked about the loss and damage fund. I mean, I think, there was a landmark agreement, but there is a lot to be done, as Kishan has already suggested. And, in a sense that not enough funding went into it, but that was a key focus. And in particular, in relation to the geographically diverse board that will be established, and that was, as a result of the COP28 decision making. Initially, obviously, that will be managed by the World Bank, and Dr. Nasser's suggestion to create a climate-specific bank was incredibly interesting, and I think, that's fantastic, and that could be a feasible option. Again, climate finance targets, we've made progress in the context of the new collective quantified goal, which builds on that 100 billion pledge. Again, is it enough? There's obviously, in many people's views, that's not enough. There's more to be done. But again, I guess the global goal and adaptation, and the calls to ensure that we double adaptation finance and plans for assessment, I think that needs to be the focus, and there needs to be a lot more on that. So lots of positive outcomes, but the next phase on just transition is how do you implement those in a fair and equitable way?
Thanks, Maria. And indeed, implementation of the commitments is really quite key. And making sure that it's done in a just and equitable way really is fundamental. But maybe we need to even take a step back from that and to understand what happens next year if there's regime change in terms of commitments. We have these commitments now, but what are the risks around change, around time inconsistency? What are the risks around policy changes and the commitments that we've seen at COP28? Some people believe they may not have gone as far as they'd wanted to, but at the end of the day, we do have commitments. So what are the risks around change? Dr. Nasser, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're bringing up something that is very dear to the heart of economists. How do you have time consistency in terms of your commitments, in terms of policy? And we've seen that in the past. If you look at when the Trump administration came to power in the United States, it removed or went out of or disrespected all the commitments made previously by the United States on climate and climate-related issues. So the question is, how do you make sure that current policy commitments taken at COP28 will continue to be met? So I think that raises an overall governance issue. Part of the problem is that when you bring countries together, how do you ensure monitoring of their commitments? That's one part. And the related part is a question of enforcement. What if you don't keep to your commitments? So what's going to happen then? We don't really have an enforcement mechanism. And then you can turn around and say, well, these are sovereigns. I cannot impose on them. Are you going to have a Security Council for Climate? If you think about it from that point of view, I don't see that. But I think it raises many issues. But I want to come back to something that was mentioned a bit earlier concerning fragile and vulnerable countries. When we talk about the loss and damage fund, many of the countries that were requesting that are those that have already suffered. But one of the things that really concerns me, and I work with lots of governments in the region, is that many of them don't have the expert and technical capacity to have climate strategies and to develop climate strategies. They do not have the expertise. They do not have the people. They haven't, say, had a climate map of their country to say, where are the vulnerabilities, what it is that they should be doing. Look at the case of Libya that Kishan was mentioned a bit earlier. So you had two dams that were built, whatever, 30, 40 years ago. They were not designed to withstand the types of hurricanes. We now call them Mediterranean hurricanes. We have a new name for it, metcanes. Metcanes are increasing. So when a metcane came, these two dams collapsed, and 20,000 people, to the best of our knowledge, maybe even more, died as a result of it. So your infrastructure is not climate resistant. These are critical things. But how many countries around the world have the capabilities of Europe or the United States or even the GCC countries to understand what it is that they need to do? What do they have to do for climate risk adaptation? What do they need to do for climate risk mitigation? Where will they get the financing? Again, the IMF has looked at some estimates. And if you're just looking at mitigation, they're talking about potential increases if the public sector has to finance it, of increases that would mean up to increases of debt to GDP by 50%. That cannot work. It's not going to happen. Many countries simply don't have the fiscal space to do so. So where is the fiscal space going to come from? They're not going to be able to do that. So again, we have to come back to private sector having to finance much of it. And all that means that over time, you've got to start thinking seriously about carbon taxation and introducing climate risk pricing into the pricing of loans and into capital market securities. And so the capital market authorities, the central banks, have all got to get together and provide the right price incentives schemes so that the private sector can get the financing. So a lot needs to be done. And I'm all for lovely statements, which usually come up from any type of UN meetings. But I'm a hard-headed economist, and I like to see something about what am I doing about prices, because that is what people respond to. If I change the price of something, they will respond to it. If I impose a carbon tax, companies will respond to that. I'll make just less use of my cars, but will put up solar panels, etc., etc. So I think we need to be very hard-headed when we deal with these issues. And my real concern is, when we talk about climate justice, is that many people are going to be left behind. And it's not just people, not just the human animals, as Kishan was pointing out. There are all those other animals that don't have a voice. And the plants don't have a voice. The rest of the planet doesn't have a voice. It does not attend COP28.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser. And indeed, climate justice, it is fundamental. And, discussions around carbon taxes, around climate risk pricing, there's not been enough discussion around those areas. And you mentioned the risk of enforcement. And so I'd like to move on to Sarah. A lot of the text in COP28, the agreement that came out yesterday, it's not actually based on decisions, but it references less absolute language. For example, some of the main commitments are that states will contribute towards certain measures. And even where we do have absolute commitments, how can these be enforced? How can we ensure that governments and the private sector, civil society, academia, and so on actually work together to achieve these goals?
Thanks. And I mean, as Dr. Saidi's already mentioned, the short answer is that a lot of these things aren't easily enforceable. And I think, when you train as a mediator, and certainly what I see in practice is that actually, when you've reached a good deal, when basically no one's really happy with it, but everyone can just about live with it. And I think, reading the reactions of various people after COP, we've kind of got to that position where we've got something that pretty much everyone can live with at the moment, but no one's kind of doing cartwheels in the street in terms of having got absolutely everything that they wanted from it. And you often see this in, really hard negotiated agreements that ultimately you don't have very precise language. You don't have the language that any particular one party would have wanted in order to be able to be absolutely certain about what the outcomes would be. But ultimately, if you want to get to an agreement, that's the kind of language that you're going to end up with. And so there we are. We've got commitments that are in relatively woolly language, definitely not things that we'd want in commercial agreements. But things that we see a lot and experience a lot in these kind of international covenants. Now, in terms of kind of the theory of enforceability, if we were able to get to a position where we thought we could interpret some of these things to really, have a specific implementation burden on individual states, there are mechanisms in the underlying framework convention, which essentially say that, things can be referred to the ICJ or to separate arbitration mechanism. I have to say that not all the states that have signed up to that framework convention agree that they would necessarily be subject to the ICJ on those issues. There's some exceptions to that, although most of them say that they would be. And there are other enforcement mechanisms around some of the more specific individual commitments that are made by states. So, for example, there is a mechanism around the Kyoto program.
I think you're on mute, Sarah.
Yeah. So there is compliance protocol, compliance committee, under the Kyoto Protocol, which obviously has more enforceable, more specific commitments that have been made by states. And to date, there have been a number of issues that have been brought by in front of that committee. And the committee has asked states to, put in place action plans in order to bring themselves within those specific commitments that they've made. So there is some progress, but that's really progress more around the transparency and the planning aspects, rather than the actual kind of implementation aspects, which, as you say, are a bit more woolly. I think the other thing to remember, though, in terms of the kind of general commitments and the recognitions, etc., that are made within the agreement, is that a lot of these really do cross over with other treaties and conventions. And those treaties and conventions, whilst it doesn't happen a lot, do get enforced. We do see cases before the ICJ, for example, in relation to things like the ICCPR provisions in relation to Indigenous people's rights and cultural rights, which are obviously referenced here as well. We know that we've got decisions of the ICJ asking the relevant states to go back and make sure that they can essentially try to give restitution or otherwise compensation in terms of how these rights have been impinged upon. So we know that that does happen, but in terms of the frequency of that, obviously not so much. So really the main kind of mechanisms for enforcement are these extra negotiation tools, kind of intrastate negotiations, and under the convention, that is, the main enforcement tool anyway. It should always be done by negotiation first, if you want something to happen. So, that's really where we are, that we've got the enforceable obligations in terms of transparency. Obviously, that's very important in terms of enabling civil society organisations, other states, etc., to be able to know where states are, how they benchmark themselves, and to be able to then exert the pressure that they want to through other kind of means. The other thing I'd say is that obviously, this is a state-based treaty. And whilst, in recent years in particular, we've seen all of this increasing activity from the private sector, a lot more private sector, attending COP, having a lot of events, etc. around it, it is still very much a state-based mechanism. And it's quite rare to have any states have actually incorporated these different aspects of international law. Obviously, we know that the UK has done that, and that's been a great way for civil society organisations within the UK to be able to challenge the UK government, and has obviously had a direct effect on corporates through things like the planning process and things that need to be taken into account. But I think the other thing I'd say about that is that some of the other cases that we've had in the UK may be a good and salient reminder of kind of where we sit on climate change. In general, in terms of the business and the overall overarching political picture. Because we know that we're in a state of crisis, we know that it's important, that it has to be done. But as the text recognises, and as Maria and others have already touched on, we know that this needs to be a just transition. We know that essentially the economy needs to keep moving forward if we're going to be able to achieve more. And certainly when the English and common law judiciary have looked at these issues, they have recognised that it's a very important aspect, but one of many different things that need to be taken into account. And so, I think we need to understand the complexity understand that there's a lot of different things behind where we are, that we're not going to get kind of direct enforcement. But that's why it's so important that we've got all of these other financial and other tools that the other panelists have been talking about today.
Thank you, Sarah. And it really does sound quite a sort of bit of a complex web in order to enforce, given initially, of course, the willingness of the commitments, but also the sort of multi sort of tier approach that's going to need to be taken, the complexity of that, starting with negotiation, but also trying to use other mechanisms, as you've mentioned, both at an international and at state level. So certainly a long way to go. I'm conscious of time, and so I'd really like to move on to a wrap-up question to each of you. And I'd like to ask what your key takeaways are, or what you see as the next steps. So what are the most important steps that need to be taken now that we've seen the agreement that came out yesterday? Where do we need to get to? What's the most important step that you see? Where do we need to get to for COP29? So just a really a concise soundbite from each of you. Kishan, if I could start with you, please.
Yeah, I think that the decision out of COP28, it was really the first time in a global UN decision that we've had an agreement over, quote, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies that do not address energy poverty or just transitions. And so this is the first time in a UN global decision that the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies has been agreed. And so this is a really important outcome of the COP28, not least obviously coming out of the main region, as you said. And so advancing this, taking this forward now, this point, alongside all the other important points that we've discussed, I think is a key one, actually, on the road to Azerbaijan, and obviously on to Brazil as well, to COP29, COP30. I think that's a key one in my mind, getting to Dr. Saidi's point on, it's about reducing also the negative drivers, the negative finance drivers of the crisis, not just about adding in, new good finance. It's about getting to the base of the drivers of the crisis, which this is part of it, of course. I would say that a big focus for the UN Development Program on the road to COP30 is, of course, going to be enhancing the NDCs. So that's going to be the next wave, the next generation of national climate plans, NDCs. And again, really deep diving, supporting our countries. The last wave of the NDCs, we supported about 80% of developing countries on enhancing their NDCs globally. And of course, in this region, in the MENA region as well. And so doing that towards COP30 and taking forward some of these issues that have come out of COP28, including the transition away from fossil fuels and how that reflects in these national plans and the targets and the finance needed. I think that's going to be really critical. Of course, we've discussed about the need to achieve that goal of the global goal on adaptation towards the next COPs. Again, a little bit below expectations, COP28, when it comes to advancing the carbon market. Really still more work to be done on that one as an important base of finance for achieving all these goals, maybe the base envisaged under the Paris Agreement. So there's still lots of work to be done. And definitely from the UN Development Program, we're working with our country partners on trying to develop capacities to advance some of these things locally. But importantly, of course, working with the private sector on really getting the innovation, technology, and finance from the private sector and bring that together with our public partners.
Thank you. And staying with the private sector, Maria, your thoughts, your key takeaways.
Yeah, I will just echo Kishan's comments on innovation, technology, and finance being key and pivotal, and the private sector obviously plays an incredibly important role, a crucial role in that. Again, I think, like any international agreements, great commitments, great to have them on paper, but it's action that really matters at the end of the day. And the implementation of these commitments is what we need to be focusing on, be laser focused on in terms of the next COPs, and achieving that right balance between the environmental, obviously the crucial environmental and economic considerations, against the backdrop of social needs of different countries, in particular developing countries, and the focus on a just transition. I think that's the crucial takeaway for me.
Thank you. And Sarah, when looking at implementation, your key takeaways?
Yeah, I think it's really about this recognition of the complex picture. And I think we've had, especially in terms of financing the transition, quite a bias towards the kind of more sexy end of doing things. But we know, for example, that we need specific minerals in order to be able to build the infrastructure for renewable energy. And yet we've got a number of development finance institutions, for example, that refuse to invest at all in mining. But investing more in mining to set the infrastructure for mining up in a responsible way that uses renewable energy from the start and takes that in is something that is going to help further on in the energy transition. So I think, really understanding that complexity and investing in the right way and getting those funds into blended finance structures to make sure that, we have the investment in the right place and that looks at the whole chain of what we need.
Thank you, Sarah. And Dr. Nasser, if I could ask you the same thing, your key takeaways.
Sure. I think there will be two, but I wanted to come back to this issue of enforcement and suggest something. When we got the COP28 or COP whatever number commitments, they need to be translated into laws, and regulations. I think we haven't had enough of that. I, for one, would advocate that they should go into constitutions, because once they go into constitutions, then you have to find a way of enforcing them. And you have a long-term commitment as a result of that. So I would then go further and say, we should have any net zero emissions targets, commitments, etc., part of the surveillance that the IMF undertakes on an annual basis under what's called Article 4. So the IMF, as you know, sends teams that assesses the economics and financial performance of companies. We should include in there their climate performance, okay? Because then I can begin to have an annual view of what's happening from climate, and potentially that could result in enforcement down the line. So I would have a document coming from the IMF with the help of maybe the World Bank and maybe some UN institutions, telling me how countries are performing versus their targets and commitments. I think that would be one interesting way. But second, I want to come back to something maybe we didn't discuss enough. I'm a believer that technology is the only way out for us. And climate tech, climate adaptation, climate risk mitigation means investing massively in terms of technology. And so what I think we need to focus on, my big focus, I think, my view is that we should need to focus much more on technology, on research and development, in particular for climate tech. And it requires massive investment. It's only technology that's going to be able to save us. And I think we need to dispel this myth that it's either this or that. No, going into so-called green economy, into climate tech, into a lot of those technologies creates jobs. You will lose jobs in some industries, but the gain, I think, what we know from many studies, the gain that will be made from going into new technologies, solar, renewable energy, carbon capture, you name it, the gains in terms of employment, in terms of the environment, are much more substantial than any losses that you might make. So I think I just want to end on a note saying we really need to believe in technology more than anything else and make sure that it happens.
Thank you, and I'd really like to thank you all. You know, the discussion has we've covered a number of points, and I think on each of those we could probably have a separate discussion, a separate webinar, and maybe we need to take that forward. But you know, I think the message is that yes, there's a positive outcome because we have seen that commitment, albeit a little bit woolly in terms of the transition away from fossil fuels, but it really is, you know, it's just one step in terms of moving towards net zero, in terms of the crisis that we're facing. And a lot needs to be done. We need to focus on it being a just and equitable transition. We need to really focus on climate adaptation, the impact of that, and the finance that's required in respect of that. We need to have real financial commitments. So we've seen commitments during COP28, but I think the clear message was that a lot more needs to be done. And that also needs, as Dr. Nasser just mentioned, needs to include investment in research and development and technology. And we've also looked at the possibility of having an independent climate bank. The need also to enhance the NDCs that we've seen. And we've also, of course, discussed enforceability and the complexity of that, and potentially how that's transposed into national laws, and potentially also through reporting mechanisms through the IMF or another body. So we've discussed really a lot of points. I think it's the start of a discussion. Obviously, the agreement only came out yesterday, and so we're all still digesting that. But certainly, I think positivity, but also a lot to be done. So, I think we have to really, take on board a lot of the discussion from today, and hope that there's going to be action, not just at governmental level, but also private sector, and that collaboration that we've talked about really does happen. So I'm conscious that we really don't have time for questions, but what I would say to the audience is please do submit any questions or follow up with us on questions, and we will do our best to make sure that they're answered by the relevant panelists, and we'll put you in touch with them. So thank you to the panelists. I really appreciate your time and your insights today. And thank you very much to the audience for joining. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.